Well, hello, my friend. Welcome back to another episode of the From Chaos to Peace podcast, where I talk about how clutter is so much more than you think, and we put a spiritual twist on clearing that clutter to get organized. Thank you so much for allowing me back into your ears. Well, hello, my friend. I'm your host, Conny Graf. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for being here. I don't take it for granted. Last week, I talked about how we sometimes sit on the fence and don't make a decision, and I talked about how the different personality types, fire, earth, air, and water, deal with that situation, and also how they can get out of it. The episode was called Sitting on the Fence is for Birds, Not for You. Well, today I want to talk about how do we actually make decisions and what different decision types there are. I've gathered a few resources that I want to talk about with you, and then we'll look at the different decision types through the lens of the 4 elements. So let's start with an article I came across in the Swiss news, actually, about the research of psychologist Barry Schwartz and his team. They describe 2 types of decision makers, the maximizers and the sacrificers. The maximizers want the absolute best. They compare every option and agonize over whether there's something better out there or not before they make a decision, if they ever get to a decision. The sacrificers, on the other hand, they're usually content with the good enough option. Therefore, they make quite quicker choices and they move on without looking back or questioning themselves. Now, to emphasize, there is really nothing wrong. Neither is wrong of the 2, not the maximizers and not the sacrificers. But maximizers often exhaust themselves and delay action, while sacrificers tend to live with more peace. But they may sometimes also not really weigh in all the options. So when we look at these 2 types through the lens of the 4 personality types, fire, earth, air, and water, we can see that fire types lean towards being sacrificers, quick to decide, but sometimes too quick, right? Earth types, on the other hand, lean towards being maximizers. They're very careful and thorough, but then often stuck searching for a perfect solution, which usually doesn't exist, right? So these are the 2 very clear ones. Air types, on the other hand, are more like hybrids. They can lean towards maximizers because they love researching and sometimes get into analysis paralysis. But mostly they get lost in too many options, right? And that's why they struggle. While water types, they lean towards being sacrificers because they decide with intuition. Now, they can delay their decision until it feels safe. So that's why they're also kind of like a hybrid. Now, this is how the 4 personality types, fire, earth, air, and water, fit into Barry Schwartz's work. But that still doesn't give us a way on how we can make a decision. How do we actually get to a decision? So let's look at some ways. The 37% rule, the 51% rule, and the hell yes rule. Now, if you listen to my podcast for any length of time, then you know I don't like rules. So these are not my rules at all. And I look at them more like helpful concepts to make a decision, right? Not as rules. So I didn't name these. I wouldn't have named these rules. These are just concepts or starting points on how to make a decision. And that's what I wanted to share with you. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start with the 30% rule, which is also called the optimal stopping rule. It's a fascinating tool from mathematics, and it says if you have a large number of options to review or to decide from, look at the first third. So that's where the 37% comes in. And then choose the first option that is better than everything else you've seen so far. So instead of looking at all options, only look at a third of it, 37%, and then pick the one that is the best out of this selection, right? Now, of course, this rule has a bit of a flaw. First of all, the most obvious, life isn't a math formula. So these people that came up with this rule, these mathematicians, right? They were in an isolated lab and not out in the real life. But also, we often really don't know how many options there are in total. So that's another flaw. So how could we even know what 37% is of all our options if we don't know all our options, right? So this is the flaw, right? But still, this rule can be helpful if we know the amount of options that we have to choose from. And when the amount of options is very overwhelming, then we can actually allocate that 37% rule and come to a better or a quicker decision. Or maybe you have to guess how many options are out there. But either way, you just look at only 37% of all the options and then pick the best one out of the 37%. So this decision-making tool might be helpful for fire types who tend to not research enough. This gives them permission to only look at 37% of all the options and then make a decision, right? Something that they want to do anyways. They're impatient. They want to make a decision. They don't want to endless research. It's also helpful for air types. Because with this rule, the 37% rule, they have less options to get lost and sidetracked in. And if they only look at 37% of the options, they actually might not get lost and actually be able to make a decision, right? And lastly, it can also be helpful for water types who don't like structured research or digging in resources, right? This keeps your required research to a minimum. So when you make an intuitive decision, it still has some foundation to it, some grounding with it, right? So, okay, that was the 37% rule. Now let's move on to the 51% rule, which is much simpler and goes like this. If you lean 51% or more towards a yes, so just more than 50%, like it's not equal. It's not like, oh, the yeses and the no keep the balance. No, you lean towards yes a little bit more, 51%, then go for it. That's what the rule says. That means we don't need to be 100% certain. In fact, often we simply can't be 100% certain. So this rule says if you're 51% certain or just a little bit more certain into either way, like yes or no, then go for it. This reminds me of a quote by Graf in his book, The Art of Taking Actions, that says, action isn't something that comes after figuring things out. Action is a way of figuring things out. So with the 51% rule, when we're kind of leaning towards one way or the other, we should go for it and take action and then figure things out along the way. We don't wait for 100% clarity and then act. We act when we have 51% clarity, and through our acting, more clarity arrives. Because let's be honest, every decision carries a risk anyways, but we can remember that there is no failure, only feedback and results. And moving forward, making a decision and adjusting along the way is usually far less risky than making no decision at all. This rule, the 51% rule, is helpful for fire types again, because it gives them justification to leap. They love to leap. They love to move on. They're very impulsive, right? But it's also good for water types who decide with intuition. If you can calm down your nervous system and listen to your intuition, then this 51% rule gives you the green light to go ahead with either of the options, right? Now, the third rule I want to talk about is the hell yes rule. So the 37% rule and the 51% rule, they get a philosophical pushback by Derek Sivers' hell yes rule, where he says, say no by default. So whenever you need to decide something, say no by default. Because if your answer is anything less than a full-throated hell yes, then you should say no. This is, of course, a different kind of decision-making tool. It's more intuitive, more an energy check than the rational 37%. And maybe even the 51% rule, because with the 51% rule, we could make a list of pros and cons and then see what is more. Like if we have more pros, then we go for it. Or if we have more cons, we don't go for it, right? Now, the hell yes rule is simply tuning into ourselves and figuring out, is it a hell yes? But that, of course, means that we have to be very clear in what we want, very clear where we want to go, very clear of our own signals, right? Not influenced by other people and what they want. We have to be very centered in ourselves. And then we only commit to things that spark an intense hell yes enthusiasm. And we decline everything else. For example, if you're asked to join a collaboration, if it's not a hell yes, you say no, keeping your time and your energy free for the work that really lights you up. But again, the prerequisite is that you're very clear on your priorities and you are very grounded and not influenced by what other people want. So this is an ideal decision method for fire types again, who love quick decisions. It helps them pause and check. Is this a hell yes or is it a no? Fire types just has to be careful that they're not just acting on impulse, that they actually really slow down and pause and check. Is it really a hell yes in me, or have I even, or am I just acting on impulse? That's what I want to say. Again, it's also might also be a good tool for water types if they are in tune with their intuition, and again, not influenced by others and what they want, which is really hard for a water type. So you have to be really clean and clear on your priorities. And if you are, then it leads to better decision making, because it helps you avoid the mental clutter and uncertainty that can come from saying yes to too many things. Now, as you have noticed, I hardly ever talked about the air types and not at all about the earth types, because they struggle, especially with this one, the hell yes one, because their mind will argue against making a decision simply from a gut feeling. So they will not really be inclined to do the 51% rule or the hell yes rule. They're really not made for earth types or air types. Those are leaning towards being maximizers, who want to research, who want to know all the options, who are worried that they don't know all the options. So here are some decision helpers for earth and air types. So I call this the pre-decided criteria method. So that means instead of defining good enough like a fire type would, and which is too vague for an earth type or an air type, we set 3 to 5 specific measurable criteria before we dive into the options. So for example, if you're choosing a new software, you set some criteria like it must integrate with X, so another software I'm using already. It must cost under Y. So you define your budget, right? And it has to be usable or in service by me and my team within Z weeks, right? So like 3 to 5 specific measurable criteria you're putting in place before you allow yourself to dive into the research mode. This anchors your maximizing tendencies into a practical but also a restrictive framework. And then you set a rule for yourself. Okay, remember, I don't like rules, so maybe another rule. Maybe you say to yourself in integrity that once a choice meets those preset criteria, the decision is made, even if you're tempted to keep researching, right? It's hard for earth and air types because they love to research. And that's how they get lost and don't make a decision. But this is a tool on how they can make a decision. Another decision helper for earth and air types can be the time-limited research method. So since you love to research, you need to give yourself a container. For example, I will compare 5 options over 2 weeks. And at the end of the 2 weeks, I will pick the best fit of those 5. With both of these methods, you still get to get your research fix, right? It creates both the depth, I can't say the word, the depth that you crave, but also gives you a hard stop that prevents endless research and ensures you actually make a decision. Well, only if you stay in integrity and actually follow your own rule, right? Okay, so here is a quick summary. Fire types lean towards sacrificing. Good enough, let's go. So you need to slow down and at least check in if it's a hell yes or just an impulse, or if you are 51% sure. Even better, maybe research a bit using the 37% rule or the time-limited research rule, making the time even shorter than my suggested 2 weeks, right? Or you use the pre-decided criteria method. Either one you use, just make sure you're not deciding on impulse. Earth types lean towards maximizing, right? Endless research and comparing. So for you, use the predefined criteria method or the time-limited research method to force yourself to make a decision and then take action, because no decision is often the riskiest decision. A wrong decision teaches, no decision traps. And that is really the real risk. Always remember that, earth types. Similar to earth types are air types. They are hybrids, but often lean towards maximizer. And they get lost in too many options. So for you, use the 37% rule to have less options to get sidetracked in, or the time-limited research option to prevent endless research and actually make a decision and not get trapped in the analysis paralysis dilemma, right? And lastly, water types, they lean towards being a sacrificer, but often delay a decision until it feels safe. You may want to use the 37% rule because you don't really like to research, and if you only have to research 1/3, that is what you prefer, right? You could also use the pre-decided criteria rule or the time-limited research rule to give a foundation and some safety to your intuition, to your intuitive decision, right? I'm not saying don't decide with your intuition. I say give a little bit of ground and a little bit of substance to your intuitive decision. And I feel most important of all is that we remember, again, a wrong decision teaches, no decision traps. And that is really the risk, that we stay on the fence, like I talked about in last week's podcast episode. And I mentioned it earlier. from the book, The Art of Taking Action. Action isn't something that comes after figuring things out, after having clarity. Action is a way of figuring things out, a way of getting clarity. So if we're leaning more towards taking action, we're trying out the 37% rule or the 51% rule, the hell yes rule, by not rebelling against the rules like I would, right? Like, these are not my names again. But if we are engaging in these so-called rules with the sole aim to actually take action and get off the fence as quick as possible, then we are on our learning path, right? We're out of the stuckness. We're out of the trap. Okay, my friend, that's it for today. If you don't know yet if you're a fire, earth, air, or water type, you can take the quiz on my website. The link is in the show notes. It's connygraf.com/quiz. Have a beautiful and amazing week. Talk to you next time. Take good care and be safe.